This is Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, and we are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And our trusty producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, trusty Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first few days of Der Fuhrer Trump. It isn't that we didn't warn you.
Yes, Ralph, but we begin the program today by taking you back to the conflict that we covered a number of years ago over the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock. As many of you may recall, the indigenous community and a phalanx of other supporters successfully protested the extension of that pipeline through their territory. This was the spring of 2016. Although they did not lead the protest, Greenpeace USA stood in solidarity with the water protectors at Standing Rock. And now Greenpeace is being sued. They're being sued by the builder of the pipeline, a company called Energy Transfer Partners. They're using a legal technique known as a SLAPP suit, SLAPP. That stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. Our first guest, Deepa Padmanabha, is Senior Legal Advisor at Greenpeace USA, and she will be defending that organization on February 24th against a legal action that has potential consequences beyond Standing Rock. First Amendment implications for ordinary people. If Energy Transfer Partners manages to win this case, it would set a precedent that threatens to have a chilling effect on the entire activist community, no matter what the cause. Next up, we welcome back former State Department official Josh Paul, who resigned from the State Department in October 2023 over his disagreement with the Biden administration's continued supply of lethal military assistance to Israel as it bombed Palestinian civilians in Gaza. He's founded an organization along with Palestinian-American Tariq Habash called A New Policy. A New Policy is an attempt to align American policy toward Israel with the values that we as Americans purport to hold, or at least aspire to. Those foundational principles of liberty, equality, democracy, and human rights, as opposed to how we've been acting so far, which is being complicit with an ethnic cleansing. We look forward to talking to Mr. Paul about how a new policy will work to accomplish that change. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our tireless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's talk about a lawsuit that could have a chilling effect on the entire activist community, no matter what the cause. David?
Deepa Padmanabha is Senior Legal Advisor at Greenpeace USA, where she works closely with environmental activists seeking to exercise their First Amendment rights to promote systemic change. In September of 2022, she testified before the House Committee on Oversight and Reform on Greenpeace USA's experience with legal attacks from extractive industries and the importance of federal anti-SLAPP legislation. And her work is focused on defending Greenpeace entities in the U.S. against two SLAPP lawsuits attempting to silence the organization's advocacy work. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Deepa Padmanabha.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, welcome, Deepa. Let's tell our audience the status of this case. As I understand it, there were many protests against this conduit connecting pipeline by a company named Energy Transfer, whose CEO is Kelsey Warren, a very aggressive Texas multi-billionaire whose company owns a lot of pipelines and who is a huge donor to Donald Trump after earlier supporting Ron DeSantis for the presidential nomination. So he's known to be very, very aggressive, and he's trying to shut you down with a $300 million lawsuit alleging all kinds of activity by you with indigenous tribes who are on the front lines opposing, for a variety of reasons, the extension of this pipeline in North Dakota. Now, the case is Energy Transfer versus Greenpeace. It's going to trial next month, and I want to provide a framework for the listeners before we get into the details on how to fight back against such lawsuits. They're called SLAPP lawsuits, listeners. So let's start out. What is a SLAPP lawsuit?
Thanks, Ralph. At first, I just want to say it's such an honor to be on your show. Yeah, so SLAPP lawsuits, SLAPP stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. And I wish we had a better acronym. It's a little wonky, but these are lawsuits that are designed to intimidate and to silence powerful voices. And what's important for listeners to know is that their intent is not to actually win on the merits. They're not designed to win in court, but being dragged through a long, lengthy, expensive legal process. The idea is that if you're hit with one of these lawsuits, it will succeed in having the intended impact, which is silencing, which is intimidating not only the person or the entity that's the defendant in the suit, but others from speaking out.
That's right. And in past SLAPP lawsuits by corporations intended to wear down the citizen groups, cost them all kinds of legal fees, there have been SLAPP lawsuits for citizen groups just having a news conference or citizen groups being part of a town meeting. Or in the case of Oprah Winfrey, who was sued by a Texas meat company because she had a critic of the meat industry on her show that reached millions of people. That case was settled. So this is the furthest extension of suppression of free speech by these artificial entities called corporations we'll get to in a moment. All right, now, the case has been filed, and have you had an opportunity to depose Mr. Warren or any others so far?
Yeah. And one thing that I think, point that you would raise that I think it's so important for listeners to know is that we often don't hear about SLAPPs because most SLAPPs are filed against everyday people who are just fighting to protect their rights to their homes, to clean air, to clean water, and they don't get the attention that the Greenpeace has. So, one of the things that I know that we'll get to later is that's a huge part of our strategy is we're not just fighting this for Greenpeace, we're fighting this for the movement and individuals who would never have the opportunity to undergo almost 8 years of massive litigation.
Okay. So listeners should know this is another example of the built-in inequality between the corporate entity and real human beings. For example, as Deepa pointed out, when these corporations file these lawsuits and pay their lawyers big fees, that's deductible under the income tax laws on corporations. But the citizen groups, who are already pretty poor to begin with and have to pay these attorney fees, they can't deduct. It has to come out of what they raise. They can't burden the tax system the way the corporations do. So keep that in mind as another example in the forthcoming battle to make corporations constitutionally unequal as artificial persons to the supremacy of real human beings. That's one of the big struggles that should be forthcoming in our country. All right, let's get to the trial here. Are you doing any mock trials yet with any public interest law firms? Sort of a dry run?
Not exactly. I mean, we have local counsel as well based in the area. So we have very much a connection to the local community and believe we have a story to tell that the jury is going to want to hear.
Now, if you do want to see about a pro bono mock trial, you can call the litigation group of Public Citizen in Washington, D.C. They do a lot of mock appeals for plaintiffs who are filing cases that are appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. So they may have some good suggestions for you. Listeners should know that Congressman Jamie Raskin has introduced legislation, obviously going nowhere under a Republican control, to establish a procedure to dismiss and deter these strategic lawsuits against public participation.
Interesting is that this latest introduction was actually bipartisan.
Oh, that's very good. Yes, I can see where that would be bipartisan. Good point. Now, one of the press reports says, quote, the lawsuit has thrown Greenpeace USA, which has been active since the 1970s, into turmoil. It's preparing contingency plans for a number of scenarios, including a bankruptcy. The group's leadership and the board have clashed over what would constitute an acceptable settlement with Energy Transfer, according to people familiar with the matter, end quote. Now, from what I know of Greenpeace and how aggressive it is, I can't believe that's an accurate statement, is it?
I don't think it's an accurate statement.
Okay.
You know, as a person who has been the legal point on this for almost 8 years, that is not consistent, but many people have different opinions. And so that may be the opinion of some individuals.
Okay. And listeners should know that even in the unlikely event that Greenpeace loses this case at the trial level and is assessed damages, it can always appeal and appeal as far as it can go. This is in the state court system of North Dakota, correct?
Correct. So there's no intermediate level. So we would go directly to the North Dakota Supreme Court. And from there, if there are issues of First Amendment to appeal, then of course we would be going to the U.S. Supreme Court.
That's good. Listeners should also know that North Dakota used to be one of the most progressive states in the country. It has a state-owned bank that's the envy of even commercial banks around the country. It has never failed. It's never asked for a bailout. It's never asked for subsidies the way Citigroup and Bank of America and other banks did from time to time, especially during the Wall Street collapse on the economy of 2008, 2009. And it also had great farmer progressive groups that sometimes actually spilled over into Minnesota. It also had Democratic senators for years until the Democratic Party abandoned North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and Utah, and not even competing against the Republicans, therefore starting out with 12 Senate seats in the pockets of the Republican Party with no competition or challenge, in case you want to know why the Democrats have trouble keeping control over the U.S. Senate. Now, give our listeners some idea, Deepa, of what claims this company's making that is upsetting them so much about what they allege Greenpeace USA did regarding this pipeline project.
Yes, I think both sides have acknowledged that this is likely the biggest case ever in North Dakota State Court. And part of that is because it's like multiple cases in one. And so when I talk about the claims, I usually divide them, I call them into buckets. There's really 3 buckets of claims. The first bucket are claims around defamation. So Energy Transfer alleges that the Greenpeace entities made false statements that caused them. And originally in this case, there were over 80 statements that they alleged were defamatory, and now we're down to 9 statements. And those 9 statements fall into 3 main categories. So the first category are statements that we made that the pipeline traverses or crosses Standing Rock Sioux Tribe ancestral land. The second category are statements we made that Energy Transfer desecrated cultural resources. And then the third category are statements made about Energy Transfer and its contractors' use of excessive force. So I think the important thing for listeners to know is this wasn't the case of a Greenpeace employee, sitting at their computer, just deciding to invent a statement one day. By the time Greenpeace made any statements, all of this was widely circulated, widely accepted in the public. And for many of these categories, we relied on the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, believing that they are the ones who are the authorities over questions about the boundaries of their land and the status of their cultural resources. So that's defamation. The second bucket is closely related to defamation, and that's tortious interference with contractual relations. So Energy Transfer alleges that Greenpeace entities made false statements to banks. And based on these false statements, banks who were involved with financing the Dakota Access Pipeline, they pulled their financing. There were delays in financing costs. There were increased financing costs. They allege that all of these banks made their decisions based on Greenpeace statements. We know that many of the banks involved in the financing had their own commitments to social and sustainability practices. And as will be shown at trial, there is no evidence that any bank made any decision based on a Greenpeace statement. Third bucket has to do with on-the-ground claims, and those are things like trespass. And that's really the bucket that makes it very clear that this attack is so much bigger than Greenpeace. It's really an attack on all of our movements. And what they're trying to establish is what I call expanding this idea of collective protest liability, where basically they're trying to create this precedent that if individuals have any involvement in training at a protest, they should be held accountable for every single thing that happened. So, in other words, if individuals are involved in training principles of de escalation, of safety, of nonviolence, that they should be held accountable for the actions of unknown protesters who, for example, use Molotov cocktails, burn construction equipment. And so that is obviously an attempt to create a very chilling impact on anybody's ability or decision to engage in protest at all. This idea we saw at Standing Rock, probably over 100,000 people show up. And this idea that if you have any involvement in training these principles, you could be held accountable for anybody. And we know that these protests and often the agitators are infiltrators. And so that's just a very dangerous theory that's trying to be established.
Yes. It's sort of a perverse use of the doctrine of joint and several liability under tort law. Now, the bulk of the opposition was by Native Americans, tribes. They were supported by Native American tribes all over the country. It was a cause célèbre. They were on the ground. They were protesting. Why isn't Energy Transfer suing these tribes as well?
Just to add to that, one of the things that's always so interesting when I talk about this case, and like I said, I've been working on these legal fights by Energy Transfer for 8 years. The first question for anybody who knows anything about the protests is, was Greenpeace even there? Did Greenpeace have any involvement? And that's therein where the truth is that this was not a Greenpeace campaign. And that was very intentional. And so our very limited involvement was solidarity, the indigenous tribes, the indigenous water protectors that were carrying this fight. And so, I mean, the question that you raised is an excellent one. And personally, I don't think that Energy Transfer likes the optics of going after indigenous people. I think that it's much easier to go after the big greens, the agitators, things like that. And they probably would be dealing with a much more difficult PR campaign if they went after members of tribes or other indigenous water.
Yes, I think they're really afraid to file lawsuits against these Native Americans, not only for the optics, but they have a real network all over the country now. It's not the old days, when these tribes were isolated. They would take children into boarding schools hundreds of miles away, the U.S. government separating them from their families, which has warranted an apology by the federal government a few months ago for doing that after a very powerful series of media exposés led by the Washington Post that worked on this for years. So that's an interesting aspect. Now, let me go back to the depositions. Tell me, have you had depositions of these officials of the corporation?
We have had more than 100 depositions in this case between both sides and third parties. So yes, definitely some Energy Transfer employees, many third parties, many Greenpeace employees, you name it.
Did it include the boss, Kelsey Warren, the CEO of Energy Transfer?
Kelsey Warren was deposed in this case.
He was?
Yes.
Well, congratulations. The litigants who lost their loved ones in the Ethiopian crash in the 737 MAX by Boeing have not been able to get the federal judge yet to approve depositions of the, at that time, CEO and head of the board of directors who've gotten off scot-free. So already you're ahead of the Boeing tort litigation by the families who lost their relatives in that crash at 550 miles an hour outside Addis Ababa in Ethiopia.
Yeah, and I'll just mention it didn't come easy. They fought tooth and nail. It even went to the North Dakota Supreme Court, but ultimately did prevail on this.
And did you get valuable information from these depositions? Their lawyers often coach them to become prolific in avoiding answering the question directly.
All of the depositions, obviously, I can't get into detail, but stay tuned to trial. If you can be there in North Dakota, that would be great. But one of the things I'll just say is that every deposition confirms and validates the fact that Greenpeace was not involved with these protests.
When I was practicing law a long time ago in Connecticut, depositions were automatically filed publicly in the court, and anybody could go and read them. But the corporate law firms have managed to get more and more protective orders and make these depositions secret. Are these depositions under a protective order?
There is quite a bit of information and evidence in this case that is subject to a pretty extensive protective order.
And tell our listeners how clients like yours are coerced into agreeing to a protective order. Because ordinarily you wouldn't want it. You'd want it public, all the questions and answers.
Yes, definitely. But, it also does go both ways. You can imagine for an entity like Greenpeace USA turning over some of our most confidential and sensitive information to a fossil fuel company like Energy Transfer. We also have a lot of sensitivity about their ability to share that. And so it's very complex, and it works both ways. And there are times where we absolutely believe that information should be in the public domain. And then there's another side to it.
I wanted our listeners to know about that. By the way, listeners, I'm sure you know this, but people all over the country who often want to speak out against corporate power, corporate control, corporate pollution, corporate crime, corporate fraud, corporate this and that, are afraid. And when you say, why don't you speak out? And they say, I don't want to be sued. Now, back in the 60s and 70s, people never said that because they didn't experience these SLAPP suits by aggressive corporations. Corporations knew better than to incur adverse publicity. They had more self-restraint than they do today, which illustrates the avalanche of advancing corporate power and corporate supremacy over what's left of our republic and democratic institutions. Let me ask you a very fundamental question. When I went after General Motors and the Corvair, General Motors couldn't sue us because at that time they didn't have any precedents to sue on behalf of artificial entities like General Motors Corporation. In other words, how can you defame an artificial entity? You can defame human beings, you can defame corporate executives. Well, how do you defame an artificial entity? Or how do you defame a product like a Corvair or a Pinto or anything else that you can see and exhibits at the American Museum of Tort Law, which I hope you will go and take a public tour free virtually. Go to tortmuseum.org. Have you raised that issue at all as a defense? How can you defame an artificial entity?
Well, unfortunately, I do think that there is case law on defamation against corporations. The one thing that they do have to establish is a heightened standard. I mean, defamation, they are allowed to bring defamation claims, but they are a public figure. And so not only do they have to go through common law defamation, but they have to establish actual malice. That, okay, let's say that these statements are determined to be false, which they are not, but if they were, they have to be made with a much heightened degree of maliciousness, of willful disregard for the truth. I hear you, and I wish we were there, but unfortunately, there are instances of defamation cases involving corporations. And
well, you make an interesting point because it's very hard to prove malice. That's the thrust of the Sullivan case, where the Supreme Court said that you can sue a public figure, but you have to show that the public figure not only defamed you, but did with malicious intent. So that augurs well for your case. Is that correct?
that's correct. Yeah, I mean, we believe these statements are true, so we shouldn't even get there. But yes, if there's any question as to the truth of the statements, then they will go down and have to ultimately prove actual malice here.
Okay. Last question before we go to Steve and David and Hannah is this. For people around the country who want help and advice on how to deal with threats to initiate SLAPP suits or actual SLAPP suits by corporations criticized by these citizens, and they could be conservative citizens, liberal citizens, it doesn't matter, they're vulnerable. There used to be a clearinghouse citizen group in Denver, Colorado that would answer questions. Is that still operating? And if so, can you give them their website?
I'm not familiar with that group, but we do have another group. So back in 2016 and 2017, when the original civil RICO cases were filed against the Greenpeace entities, all of these fights started out as RICO. Many groups across issue areas were deeply concerned that this would be the new tactic used to go to attack labor, to attack human rights, to attack every kind of organization imaginable. And so what we did at that time, Greenpeace USA was a part of it, as well as other groups, is we've created a coalition called Protect the Protest. And so Protect the Protest is a coalition of organizations to provide support for individuals who are threatened with SLAPPs, who receive cease and desist letters, who might want help either finding a lawyer, communication support, because we know that the individuals bringing these lawsuits want the fights to happen in silence. So a big part of the work that needs to be done and that we do is to bring attention to them. So people can visit protecttheprotest.org, find a lot about the coalition, and then if they are in a situation where they need some assistance, they can fill out a form online and somebody from the coalition will respond.
Excellent. Well, listeners, you know now the Greenpeace case is not just fighting to defend Greenpeace's right of free speech, but fighting to defend all citizens' right of free speech. Hannah?
Briefly, I want to circle back to the RICO charge, which is, I think, one of the more ludicrous, absurd, as a civilian, absurd points of this story. Could you briefly, this is something that you already kind of got cleared, so it's a victory that you already have in your pocket, but could you briefly say describe the RICO claim that they were making against you and the implications, if they were allowed to pursue that claim, the implications that would have on basic rights to freedom of assembly and speech?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2016 and 2017, we were hit with these back-to-back RICO cases. One was 2017 was Energy Transfer, and 2016 was a Canadian logging company called Resolute Forest Products. And these cases were brought by the same lawyers, at that time, Kasowitz, Benson, Torres, and they were shopping this tactic around, basically building a business model that this is the key, to corporations, to destroying the work of advocacy groups and the ability for groups to work together. And so these were both, one case was originally filed in federal court in Georgia. We got it moved to California. The other one was federal court in North Dakota. And we got the RICO claims in both cases dismissed. And this was civil RICO. This is different from what we're seeing in Cop City. But you can imagine this was a huge threat. I mean, first of all, to be hit back to back for Greenpeace USA, we were looking at two cases that cumulatively sought close to $1 billion in damages. And then this idea, that working with others was a criminal conspiracy, equivalent to being part of mob activity, just the public narrative was quite damaging. And I should note that particularly with the RICO, it's not just the lawsuits, but a lot of these companies also simultaneously launch PR campaigns, and they have their contractors just pushing out, getting their narrative out. We're seeing that in the Energy Transfer case much more as we get closer to trial. And so the incredible thing in this sort of journey that we forget is that these were huge wins, because now there actually is precedent. There is good law on the use of civil RICO against advocacy organizations. We unfortunately don't have the same for criminal RICO, like we're seeing in Cop City, which is still a huge threat. But since that time, we haven't seen any new civil RICO cases filed. And so that really was a big win. Unfortunately, what happened in the Energy Transfer case is that the federal judge threw out RICO. He declined to rule on the state claims. And so what Energy Transfer did is 1 week later, they took those state claims, ran to North Dakota State Court, and that is the case that's currently going to trial.
Steve?
Deepa, could you just very quickly sum up what's at stake in this case that's going to trial on February 24th?
Yeah, this case and the timing of it, this case was originally set to go to trial in this past summer, but it got moved. It was continued to February. And giving the timing of it in the new administration, I mean, this is a real test on what the future of our First Amendment rights will look like. This is a test case. We know that other corporations are looking at similar tactics. And so when I talk about not fighting this just for Greenpeace, but fighting it for the movement, we really believe that if we can show corporations, there's the inside the courtroom legal strategy But part of our strategy needs to be outside of the courtroom to show while you think you make us shrink, you make us silent, actually, those on the other side of this will come out of this stronger. And so it's really critical for us to be able to galvanize the public, to make this fight visible, to show them that it doesn't matter what happens in courtroom. Greenpeace is more than just a set of entities, right? Greenpeace is a movement. And so you can't silence, you can't bankrupt, you can't destroy a movement. And the idea is that other corporations considering this tactic, they'll look and see, well, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose in the courtroom. We don't want to galvanize the public. We don't want to make the movement that much stronger. And the one thing I want to name is the Wall Street Journal article named that some investors were concerned that this lawsuit could create a, quote, reinvigorated protest movement. And so that concern that this kind of tactic could backfire, that is really critical. And so that's where the non-lawyers, the other folks really stepping in to pay attention to this fight. We have an online petition at our website, greenpeaceontrial.org, to tell Energy Transfer, drop this lawsuit. It's really critical for Energy Transfer to see that they're not just going up against Greenpeace, they're going up against groups that Greenpeace may have never even worked with. And that's also part of what Protect the Protest does. And so we really believe that we're going to see a lot of these kinds of attacks. We already are seeing attacks against journalists. We're seeing attacks against activist groups. The playbook to destroy dissent is just going to continue to grow and escalate from all branches of government. We have HR 9495 to deal with now. And so when we can see these pivotal fights that actually can alter the trajectory moving forward, it's time for everybody to step in. And I know I'm biased in the Greenpeace fight, but I really believe that Greenpeace is one of those fights, that the future of democracy, the future of the First Amendment will look different depending on what happens in this case.
And give that website again.
greenpeaceontrial.org. And there's a sign-on letter there. And if you sign the sign-on letter, you will automatically we're going to be doing a lot of work in the lead up to trial. And so you'll automatically get those updates and information.
We've been speaking with Deepa Padmanabha, as Senior Legal Advisor at Greenpeace USA. Thank you for your very precise replies to these questions, Deepa. Last point, for anybody who wants to support Greenpeace USA with a contribution, what would be the website?
Our website is greenpeace.org. You should be taken directly to the USA site there if you're based in the US. Otherwise, it's greenpeace.org/USA.
Thank you. Well, we're looking forward to the trial. What city is it in North Dakota?
Mandan, North Dakota. So that's just across the river from Bismarck.
There you are, listeners. Get engaged in this because it affects your right of free speech wherever you live, work, and raise your families against these corporate dictatorial policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Deepa Padmanabha. We will link to her work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we welcome back State Department whistleblower Josh Paul, who has founded an organization that outlines a new American policy toward Middle Eastern affairs. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, January 31, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Hawaii and Texas residents united during a virtual meeting last week hosted by the Federal Aviation Administration to overwhelmingly oppose SpaceX's latest plans for rocket launches. SpaceX asked the FAA to increase the number of rocket landings from 5 a year to 25 a year. The company, owned by Elon Musk, also asked the FAA to expand the landing zone to around 20 times its current size. The rockets take off from Boca Chica in Texas and land in the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii or the Indian Ocean near Australia. Last week, Native Hawaiians and Hawaii residents joined the public meeting to express outrage, often saying the FAA has not made an environmental impact statement to determine what effects the landings would have on marine life. That's according to a report in the San Francisco Chronicle. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. The last time we spoke to Josh Paul, he had just resigned from the State Department over the United States government's complicity in the genocide the Israeli government was perpetrating on the people of Gaza. He's back to give us an update on what he's been doing since. David?
Josh Paul is co-founder of A New Policy. He resigned from the State Department in October of 2023 due to his disagreement with the Biden administration's decision to rush lethal military assistance to Israel in the context of its war on Gaza. He had previously spent over 11 years working as a director in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, which is responsible for U.S. defense diplomacy, security assistance, and arms transfers. He previously worked on security sector reform in both Iraq and the West Bank, with additional roles in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, U.S. Army Staff, and as a military legislative assistant for a member of the U.S. House Armed Services Committee. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Josh Paul.
Thank you very much. Honored to be with you again.
Welcome back, Josh. The State Department now is being run by Secretary of State Rubio, former senator from Florida. Very aggressive in terms of foreign policy. One might call it a militarized version of foreign policy. Do you expect more members of the State Department to quit in protest the way you did?
Thank you, Ralph. Well, I think that the time for quitting in protest over Gaza, unfortunately, in many ways, is greatly behind us. I think there will be a significant number of State Department officials who will be leaving in the coming days, weeks, and months. And this is a result of a push from the Trump administration to gut America's diplomatic corps, much as they did at the start of the previous Trump administration, but even more so this time around. What I'm hearing from former colleagues in the State Department is a sense of immense despair as they see freezes being placed on U.S. foreign assistance programs, including programs that do an immense amount of good around the world, and just a concern about the overall and impending collapse of American diplomacy.
Yes, they don't seem to respect much the foreign service people at embassies around the United States, which used to be a major bulwark of State Department diplomacy before it turned into like a militarized branch of government, which certainly contradicts its charter of over 200 years ago, which talked about focusing on diplomacy and customs issue. So let's go into the issue of continuation of the Biden support with weapons, diplomatic cover, and other arm-twisting any nations that dared to protest the shipment of weapons to enable Netanyahu's genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza, increasing now in the West Bank, still in Lebanon. Do you see any light between Trump's emerging position? Is it worse than Biden, less than Biden, or still open for hope or dread?
So I think there are a few things to pick apart there. The first is I think we have to acknowledge the precedent set by President Biden, not only in his unconditional support for Israel and its attacks on Gaza, its violations of international humanitarian law, but also in President Biden and Secretary Blinken's willingness to set aside U.S. laws when it came to, in particular, security assistance and arms transfers in order to continue that support. That is a precedent that I think all Americans should be concerned about, regardless of their thoughts on the conflict itself, because we don't want our presidents ignoring U.S. law, and we want a Congress and a judicial branch that is willing to enforce those laws, neither of which we had under President Biden, and he has now handed that condition over to President Trump, who will surely exploit it in both the same and new ways. When it comes to President Trump's position on U.S. support for Israel, so first of all, I would say that what we face in America is a problem set that runs much deeper than any change in administration, than any political party. There is an entrenched dynamic within American politics, an entrenched set of both political and economic incentives across our electoral system that are maintaining U.S. unconditional support for Israel, regardless of what the American people might want. And we've seen in the last year, poll after poll, across both Democrats and increasingly Republicans, showing that the American people do want a change, do not think that we should be complicit in a genocide, complicit in violations, gross violations of human rights by partners such as Israel that use American weapons. I think that what we will see in the Trump administration, unfortunately, certainly based on President Trump's initial round of appointments is very much a continuation, if not a deepening, of President Biden's approach. In fact, we have already seen President Trump lift the pause, the sole pause that President Biden imposed on 2,000-pound bombs. We just saw a delivery in the past few days of the first of 130 new armored bulldozers to the IDF that will be used to destroy Palestinian homes in the West Bank. And so while I do think that President Trump will be keeping an eye on his base and certainly an ear on some important regional voices, and there I would say there are countries in the region who are trying to push back, from the starting point, it looks rather grim.
Well, just to step back for our listeners, Josh Paul was referring to 6 federal laws that condition the shipment of weapons to foreign countries. For example, any countries that violate human rights, any countries that obstruct U.S. humanitarian aid from entering would not receive U.S. weapon shipments. So Biden and Blinken were violating, and Secretary of Defense Austin, they were all violating 6 federal statutes in shipping weapons to Netanyahu. Actually, they almost admitted it at one point when they warned Israel that if it didn't let some humanitarian trucks in, they may invoke some of these laws that they have been violating despite their oath of office to observe the laws of the land. So let's go back just for a moment. There's a debate in liberal circles in the U.S. as to whether Trump is worse or better or about the same as Biden. You're permitted a little speculation here before we go to the contemporary scene. If Trump was president during October 7th instead of Biden, do you have any doubt that he would have supported Netanyahu and weaponized the genocide the way Biden did?
I think it is very likely that he would have, certainly at the start, taken very much a similar approach to President Biden's of, opening the floodgates of American weaponry and disregarding, as you said, laws that apply to the provision of security assistance. I do think that he would have been more persuadable to shift perspective over the course of the last 15 months than President Biden was, because the one difference between them is when it comes to Israel, President Biden was very much an ideologue, a self-proclaimed ideologue. President Trump, on the other hand, it's very clear in all of his foreign policy transactions, is a transactionalist, is, always asking what is in it for his administration or for him. And I think that, would have created certain opportunities to be more swayed by, again, voices within his own base, by voices within Saudi Arabia or elsewhere in the region. Speaking of his own base, would a President Trump have continued on such a path, knowing or being aware of the electoral consequences in a way that the Biden and then, Harris campaign did? I doubt it. So I think if there is organization, if there is movement, there is an opportunity for shifts. But again, I think the problem is that the spectrum of what President Trump could do, while it may have some space for improvement, also has a lot of space for degradation and for things getting worse. And I think that's where we are starting.
Well, Trump, when he was president, as you know, Josh Paul, he supported annexation of the West Bank, and he moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, and he endorsed the legality of keeping the Golan Heights conquered by Israel in prior conflict. Now, do you credit Trump as being a sine qua non for the short-term ceasefire that's now underway in Gaza?
I would certainly credit the change in administration, and I do think that President Trump's staff, including Stephen Witkoff, the new U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, did play an important role. I don't know that Prime Minister Netanyahu would have come to that ceasefire agreement absent the Trump administration coming into office and wanting to give Donald Trump a sort of quick win as he was entering office. Let's not overstate that win. It is absolutely vital for there to be a ceasefire. It is absolutely vital for humanitarian assistance to flow in. It is absolutely vital for hostages to be released from both sides. But a ceasefire that, first of all, we need to see it stick and hold into and through phase 2 and then phase 3. And of course, the ceasefire does nothing to address the underlying political dynamic that will continue to create and generate harm and suffering for the people of Palestine.
It's not a good sign that Trump has not objected to the continuation of bombing and bulldozing and kidnapping Palestinians in the West Bank. So Netanyahu seems to have shifted his battleground more to the West Bank that has about 3 million Palestinians in him. And he is clearly violating the Lebanon ceasefire. He has damaged or blown up over 1,000 houses in South Lebanon since the ceasefire started in Lebanon. His troops are still in South Lebanon. They're damaging villages, and they're preventing their inhabitants who escaped to the north from going back to their villages. Is that a bad sign? Does that augur negatively for Donald Trump, that he can't tell Netanyahu what he should be doing?
So, I mean, let's acknowledge that Benjamin Netanyahu is a very canny politician, and he is a politician who ran rings around Joe Biden. Netanyahu is going to be coming to Washington, D.C., to the White House. He is the first foreign leader that President Trump has invited to the White House on February 4th. And I think that we can expect that he will come with a cunning plan to run rings around President Trump, perhaps offering a deal such as the continuation of the ceasefire into phase 2 in exchange for certain commitments from the US. I think President Trump should be well aware that it is the US that has the upper hand in any negotiations with Israel, as by far the more powerful partner, the partner that is the source of most of Israel's defense capabilities, of its diplomatic protection, of Benjamin Netanyahu's personal protection from the International Criminal Court. And so I think the question for Donald Trump is, will he let Benjamin Netanyahu run rings around him too?
Well, we had Gideon Levy, the columnist for Haaretz newspaper in Israel, on the show recently, and he made an interesting statement. He said Netanyahu was not afraid of Obama, and he wasn't afraid of Biden, but he's afraid of Trump. At the time when I heard that, I probably should have said, Gideon, it's also reciprocal. Trump is afraid of Netanyahu, and the powerful Israel government can do no wrong lobby in the United States. How would you comment on that?
Again, I think that President Trump has proven to be a transactionalist and, of course, can be deeply unpredictable. So I think that there's probably a greater need for tact on the part of Prime Minister Netanyahu. But as you just referred to, I think he can also depend at the end of the day, regardless of what direction President Trump may wish to go, on the deep well of support that has been built over many years at great expense within and across American politics in support of the Israeli government can do no wrong lobby, as you just called it, who, whether through the personnel that have been appointed, that have been brought in around President Trump, whether through a Congress that seems to always vote in favor of whatever that lobby wants, will continue to stand up for Prime Minister Netanyahu's interests, which, of course, are not America's interests.
Let's go to your new group. Josh Paul, you resigned under protest, which is a tradition in this country, but you've taken it to the next step. You not only gave the reasons for your resignation, you were part of the approval process in the State Department for weapon systems to foreign countries, and you would have reasonable debates inside the State Department, pro and con to this country or that country. But when it came to Israel, there was no debate. It was just automatic, and you could not tolerate that as a member of the civil service. So now you have started a new group. It's called A New Policy, and you want to change the dynamic in Congress, which is the basis of this whole devastating empire practices all over the world, by funding it, allowing wars to be declared by the president, armed incursions to be declared by the president, not holding the president accountable to constitutional and statutory provisions, as we mentioned earlier, the 6 federal statutes that are being violated. Tell us about this group, A New Policy, and who your co-director is.
Yes, thank you. So A New Policy was co-founded by myself and by another one of those who resigned from the Biden administration, Tariq Habash, a Palestinian-American who was a Biden political appointee in the Department of Education. And it was both Tariq and my observation while we worked in government, and I think just as much since we left government, that as much as US policy towards Israel, US actions towards Israel manifest as a policy problem, at their root, they're actually a political problem. that there is a unique political set of circumstances that prevents open policy discussion, even within government and in the US public sphere, on our college campuses, in our private sector, whose roots are not the policy issues. I think a lot of people understand the policy issues. I've talked to a lot of, for example, members of Congress in the last year who in private will say, what we are doing is wrong. Our weapons are being used to commit war crimes. But of course, I can't say that out loud. I can't say that publicly. And that is because what we face is a set of political economic incentives for elected officials that has taken away that sort of free debate, that open discussion that is key to functioning in a democracy when it comes to US policy towards Israel. And so what a new policy is here to do is to bring balance back to that, to, first of all, shift the narrative and help American people, and I think they already do intuitively understand that what we are doing in our complicity, in our unconditional support to Israel, is not in America's interest. It is in direct contravention of our values, and that at the same time, there is a need to take the immense momentum that has been generated, the immense number of people across America of all creeds, of all backgrounds, who have stood up in the last year to say not in our name, and to channel that into America's politics in a way that our system is designed to respond to. And in part, that means lobbying and engaging with communities across America. In part, I'm sorry to say, that means engaging in election finance and ensuring that there is money behind candidates who are willing to speak up and money against candidates who are, not willing to speak their minds or who are so craven as to bend to Prime Minister Netanyahu and those who represent his interests.
Tell us about your co-director.
Yeah, so Tarek Habash grew up in Middletown, Ohio, actually in the same high school as J.D. Vance went to, but a few years behind him. He is a very proud Palestinian American who was working as a presidential appointee for President Biden in the Department of Education, where he was leading on issues such as student loans and other education policy. He resigned on January 3rd of 2024 because as a Biden political appointee, he could not serve a president who did not see him, who did not recognize the humanity of his own people. I can only imagine how very difficult that was, having campaigned for President Biden, having served the Biden administration, to then have essentially the White House spit in his face and say, we are going to arm the killing of your people, and there is nothing you can say or do about it. Since leaving, Tarek has been a very, very strong voice for a better policy, and also one who understands Middle America, having grown up in the Ohio suburbs. And so I'm really is a fantastic colleague, and I think the two of us make a great team together.
Can you give us slowly the website for your new group titled A New Policy so people can connect and see if they want to engage and support?
Yes, and I would say to your listeners, please do visit us. You will learn more about our policy platform, more about how we are going about our work, and more about ways to support us, whether by signing up for our mailing list or contributing, or there are various ways to support. You can find all of those on A New Policy, that's all one word, anewpolicy.org.
That's A New Policy, one word, org. Are you getting some good reception among the, say, 5 dozen members of Congress who have displayed some critical independence in what they say and do about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yes, and not only them. I will say that, because our message is clear that ultimately we are here to pursue American interests, American values. I don't know what other lobby groups whose interests they are here to pursue, but we are here to put American interests and values in the front. And because of that, we've been able to speak with scores of members of Congress and congressional officers, both in the House and the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans. And, I think this is, let's be clear, going to take a long time. This is going to be the work of multiple election cycles. This is going to be, as they say, an iterative process. But I think there is an understanding, certainly behind closed doors, well beyond the few members of Congress who've been willing to speak up on this. And if we can engage in the process and bring together both the voters and the money necessary to demonstrate that there is a political win here, and I think that is increasingly the case, then we will see change. Our position is to support Palestinian self-determination. I think that, whatever form that takes, it has been a long time that America has been dictating what the outcome of the peace process should be. And I think that the history here is that we have not followed through on those commitments. I think the most important thing is to hear from the Palestinian people themselves what direction they would like to go in. A confederation is one option, a two-state solution is another option, a one-state solution is another option, but ultimately self-determination is a right of all peoples, and our job is to stand firm behind the direction the Palestinian people would like to go in, and of course the direction that is in the best interest of all people in the region, all people's right to self-determination, and of a just and lasting peace.
Well, we're out of time, Josh. We've been talking with Josh Paul, who is the co-founder of this group, A New Policy, oneword.org, with Tarek Habash, who also resigned from the Biden administration's Department of Education due to this disgraceful policy toward Gaza. And we urge our listeners to get in touch, get feedback. If you want to support A New Policy, I'm sure you'll be very welcomed into this growing effort to bridge the gap between the expanding demand by the American people, as the polls show, for peaceful resolution of this conflict and the continuing belligerence and genocidal support that is reflected regularly in our U.S. Congress and White House. Thank you very much, Josh Paul.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor.
I want to thank our guests again, Deepa Padmanabha and Josh Paul. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each program. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Anna Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you very much. Log into this new group by Josh Paul called A New Policy.
You know what's right.